this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
On the morning of 20th of May 1941, the Germans launched Operation Mercury. The invasion of Crete was the largest airborne operation yet attempted during the war, with thousands of Fallschirmjäger deployed. Key to the operation's success would be the capture of the airfield at Maleme. Outnumbered and having suffered horrendous casualties when the airborne troops secured Hill 107 overlooking the airfield, it opened the door for reinforcements and ultimately the Allied withdrawal from the island. For this episode, I'm joined by now regular of the show, Robert Kershaw, who was last with us to discuss Dunkirk. He has a new book available, The Hill, The Brutal Fight for Hill 107 in the Battle of Crete. Robert, welcome back. Before we get to Crete, we should perhaps set the scene. The Allies had just been forced to withdraw from Greece. I wonder what condition the British and Commonwealth troops were in on Crete.
Pretty powerless, because rather like Dunkirk, they didn't get any of the heavy equipment out. And really, the war for that expeditionary force had simply been rearguard actions, constantly in contact with the enemy, and withdrawing all the time to the south. So a bit like the picture in France before, in that the Germans outflanked the force by coming through Yugoslavia, which was unexpected. And again, a bit like the Belgians during the Blitzkrieg, the Greeks surrendered, and that left no option but to get across the Peloponnese to the south and away as soon as possible. So the entire campaign in Greece was a succession of retreats and quite intensely fought rearguard actions, trying to buy time to break clean of the main body. And the brigade, the 5th New Zealand Brigade, that ends up on and around Hill 107, barely got away and had been part of this retreat. And so their background, as soon as the war had begun for them actively, was being completely assailed by the Luftwaffe whenever they moved, and barely getting out of the southern ports near Athens amid air raids.
Were they expecting to be attacked on Crete? Was it seen as being the next German objective?
I think initially, the answer to your question probably is yes, but initially it was about survival and getting away from Greece. That was the main intimidating factor that was governing everything they did. And then on arrival in Crete, there was a brief period before the air raids by the Luftwaffe stepped up again. And during that time, they tried to reorganize, and then they were tasked to defend the island of Crete. The plan was already in its infancy, as 5 Brigade, for example, the Australians and Brits were also being evacuated and landing. And broadly speaking, the New Zealanders, when they arrived in Suda Bay, moved west, and the Australians moved east. The Brits were already further east in Herculean. And essentially, it was about securing the 3 airfields on the island and repelling an anticipated amphibious landing.
It's Kurt Student who'd be in overall command of the air assault on Crete. Now, this would be the biggest air assault ever attempted. Why did the Germans choose an airborne invasion? I mean, usually they've been doing those small coup de main attacks, haven't they?
Much of it is politics, in the sense that since the invasion of Greece, the Fallschirmjäger, the paratroopers, had not been used in action. And in fact, they disappeared off the radar, much to the Allies' concern, and they didn't know where they were. Meanwhile, Student was told there was no plan to use paratroopers in Russia, which was the next major operation facing the Wehrmacht. And because of the unrest in the Balkans, and in particular a pro-Hitler regime in Yugoslavia was replaced by a military coup d'etat, and they changed tack from being compliant to the Germans to being actively in opposition. Hitler then decided, as a punitive measure, to invade Yugoslavia, and at the same time the Italians, who had already attempted to invade Greece through Albania, were in serious trouble, and Hitler appreciated that he also needed to support the Italian effort. And the Balkans was too vulnerable an area to be left to his rear flank as they advanced into Russia. So it was decided to conduct a rapid campaign to take it out.
So what is Student's plan for the airborne attack?
I think the first thing you should bear in mind is that Student was nearly mortally wounded in Holland. He'd been hit in the head by a bullet, ironically fired by the SS in a little fracas during the surrender negotiations for Rotterdam. And he had been in hospital on a failing lifeline for a bit, for some 6 months, and there was some scepticism about his ability to take up a corps commander, which he became. The Fallschirmjäger divisions were expanded to corps size, and Student was put in charge, had been given the Knight's Cross for his achievements in France, but he was still actually recuperating as he put the plan together for the invasion of Crete. He was, like many senior commanders, very ambitious and wanted to cut his teeth by securing the only strategic objective ever accomplished to date by air, by attacking the island of Crete. And he convinced Hitler, but not his senior commanders, that he could do it. The plan was very much like had been attempted in the Low Countries and Belgium, which was the so-called oil spot strategy, which was to land at multiple places behind enemy lines, and really like what happens when an oil spot drips into a puddle, the slick spreads rapidly across the puddle. And the oil spot strategy was just that there would be multiple landings, and that would create a paralysis amongst the defence, and they would all give up or make mistakes or not act coherently. It had worked in France, but most mature thinkers had already assessed that it was unlikely to work again because it had happened once before, and the Allies would anticipate such an attempt.
Well, if we look at those defenders at Maleme and around Hill 107, which overlooks the airfield, had they put special consideration into an air attack by airborne troops? I mean, did they see it as being a likely event to happen?
It was seen as a possibility, but there was also much talking and reporting about a potential amphibious landing by the Germans as well. And you tend to fight the last war you were in, and most of the senior commanders were First World War and land-centric, and nobody really, despite what had happened the year before, had the first idea about airborne warfare, which is understandable because this is only, if you like, months after the collapse of France. And, for example, the battalion commander on Hill 107, Andrew, had an intelligence sergeant who knew nothing really about airborne warfare other than what had been picked up in the press. And in fact, all the post, if you like, blitzkrieg interrogations that had occurred with German paratrooper prisoners, all that stuff hadn't been handed down to troop level in the form of pamphlets about what to do in the event of an airborne landing. So really, for these people, an airborne landing is something like out of H.G. Wells' fiction, something that they could not really imagine would happen to them. I think you need to bear in mind that most people before the war hadn't even seen an aeroplane, really, never mind parachutists in any numbers.
So what are the defences like around the airfield? Because one would assume as it's operational, it will be pretty well defended. And it's if I say it's on the coast, it's in the coastal region, isn't it?
Well, we say that in hindsight because we know what happened. But at the time, the 5 New Zealand Brigade plan, which was put in place by Brigadier Hargest, the boss, was essentially coastal defence. When you look at the globs of battalion and company positions on the map, you can see that the configuration is really to repel some form of coastal landing in depth. And at Maleme, there was only one company from the entire brigade actually on the airfield itself, with platoons at the north, west and south end. This is in complete comparison, if you like, to Chappell's British Brigade in Heraclion, which had its main strength actually sited around the airfield itself. Maleme was a kind of compromise in that there was this hill mass, Hill 107, that completely overlooked the airfield. And really, in order to use the airfield, you've got to take the hill mass. So you could argue that, well, you only need a company on the airfield for immediate defence. The main strength needs to be on the high ground that is able to cover the airstrip by fire.
Is that an active airfield? I'm not sure what at this point in the war quite who has air superiority.
The Luftwaffe had total air superiority both in Greece and Crete. There were virtually no British or Allied aircraft left on the island just before the invasion. They'd either been shot down or they'd flown out to Egypt because they knew what was coming. So the Germans did have complete mastery of the air. The New Zealanders were well aware of how difficult it was going to be because they'd already tasted air superiority on Greece. But nevertheless, they went ahead with a plan, the configuration we've already talked about, but involved the ability of the units in depth to counterattack forward in the event of the aerodrome, which I call it, being captured. This airstrip had only been constructed the year before. It had no hard standing. It was packed earth. It could take fighter aircraft, a little more problematic for the Ju-52 transport aircraft, but you wouldn't imagine scores of them being able to land on the airstrip that they had. But because it wasn't, if you like, hard-standing runways, it was a flat, hard-packed area. So depending on wind, you could land on it from any particular direction.
Well, I did like I like this idea. The defenders stood to each morning in case of attack, which is very reminiscent of the First World War, standing to at dawn. Does this mean that they're ready when that air assault comes in on the morning of the attack?
Yes, they're anticipating an attack, and they're anticipating an airborne attack, but they had no comprehension of the intensity of the Luftwaffe air bombardment that preceded it, or the shape and form of the subsequent air assault that followed it. All that was beyond their experience, and so every major event was a surprise, despite the fact that they were anticipating airborne landings. Nobody had ever seen one.
How do those landings go? Because, I mean, throughout the war, even as we get good, I would say get good at them, airborne landings could be extremely scattered. They could be they're quite hit and miss. So how concentrated did the Germans manage to get their troops on the ground? Did they even manage to get them where they wanted to get them?
Yes and no. You're absolutely right. An airborne assault is a pretty iffy enterprise. You've got two options. One is direct assault, jump over the enemy positions and hope to shock them into defeat, if you like. And the other possibility is an offset assault where you land nearby, form up as coherent units, and then assault the airfield. In the event of the airdrome at Maleme, what in fact happened, the plan was for the Sturm Regiment, which was the elite part of the expanded airborne corps, which had been expanded from a glider raiding party to a glider battalion, supported by a heavy weapons parachuted battalion and 2 infantry battalions. They were to land either side of the Maleme airport and converge on it and take it out. What went wrong was that Meindl, the regimental commander, had opted for a direct assault, which was reckless in the extreme because they didn't know it, and it was a result of a German intelligence failure. But he was attacking with some 1,800 airborne troops up against an opposition of about 11,500 men. So the odds were 6-1, which is not career enhancing for whoever is attempting to lead that to success. The landings on the west side of the airdrome were reasonably concentrated, but the extremities of it were punished by fire from the defenders. But the battalion that was due to land on the east or right side of the airfield, as you're looking at the sea, jumped right on top of the established battalion positions and was cut to pieces virtually to a man. The battalion was combat ineffective pretty soon after it had reached the ground. There were other factors that caused that, one being that the proposed drop zone for that battalion was a linear drop zone parallel to the sea running from east to west, because the initial air recce recognised that the prevailing wind was blowing offshore. If they had attempted that, many of the paratroopers would have been blown into the sea. So in mid-flight, amazingly, they changed the drop zones so that the aircraft flew into the interior of the island and then turned toward the sea, and they came up from the south rather than from the seaward side and dropped up until the coastline. Now, that was the move that put them right on top of the New Zealand positions, and they were massacred. And the battalion commander, in fact, virtually every officer bar one in that battalion was either killed or wounded.
I mean, it's not a great picture you paint, which makes you wonder how quick are the New Zealanders to react. One would have thought of that as this drop is being scattered and not working. Are they in a position to counterattack and repulse and to basically take them out in penny packets?
Yes, the New Zealanders reacted very firmly and aggressively, the soldiers in particular, and they severely punished the landings to the extent that it seemed to be a no-goer shortly after the initial waves had landed.
There is a second wave. What's the gap between the first and the second wave?
The initial landings were on the west side of the island. So there was a regiment dropping around Maleme, which was the Sturm Regiment, and there was another regiment, the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, jumping into Prison Valley, which was a valley that ran almost in parallel to the Maleme positions inland for about 2 or 3 miles. And that valley converged on Arnia, the capital, which was the objective of the landings. They were also severely punished as they jumped out. And so you had a situation where the combat coherence of the battalion's jumping was fractured by the number of casualties, particularly among leaders, that they suffered. The landings in Prison Valley were just as badly punished as those that landed around Maleme. And as we also know, the third wave came in the afternoon, attacking, 2 waves, one attacking Rethymnon further to the east, and the other Herculean, further east still. And both those assaults were heavily punished, and they were not really coherent combat groups left after a day's fighting.
And on that Hill 107, Andrew, who's in charge of the defence of that airfield, how much could he see and intervene from his position?
Yeah, this is key. My research suggests that he couldn't see much, despite being on the summit. And the major problem was the lack of communications. Having retreated from Greece, they didn't have their proper radio package. They are making do with the Greek telephone system and wire-laid field telephones, which were immediately disabled by the Luftwaffe beating up raids that occurred in tandem with the main airborne assault. So Andrew assumed shortly after the landings that the company around the airfield was in serious trouble because many of the glider wave had already assaulted their positions, but he had no idea what was left really on the airfield. He subsequently discovered they had suffered but were still holding on. He also lost contact with his headquarters company, which was in Maleme village. There were major drops on top of the village, and he assumed, because he hadn't heard anything, that they'd been overwhelmed. And his forward D company, which was on that dry bed riverline that flows into the sea nearby, he had no messages from them and assumed that they'd been overrun by the combined glider and parachute assault. But they also were holding in place. Meanwhile, the Germans had reacted very aggressively and, despite their casualties, continued to attack, which resulted in their regimental commander, Meindl, being seriously wounded in the chest and taken out of action. So they're in crisis mode, but still attacking. Andrew, who had been suffering from combat stress, really, still, from the First World War, like his boss, Hargest, both of them distinguished First World War soldiers, Andrew with the Victoria Cross. They were not acting as you would assume they might do on the day. They both reacted far more effectively later in the Western Desert, but on Crete, they appeared to be paralysed by what was going on. In particular, Andrew had received a shed load of Luftwaffe bombing, been hit in the forehead by a piece of shrapnel, and the intensity of that bombing he likened to what he'd experienced on the Somme. So that must inevitably have brought to the surface his previous combat stress disorder. And I suspect it affected his decision-making also, which was also the case with Hargest, because although he was ensconced in a headquarters far too far away from the forward position that at Maleme Airdrome, he'd been strafed and, like everybody else, couldn't move during the day, but didn't make any attempt either to move forward to find out what was happening. And what happened during the day is that the aggressive, outnumbered German attacks made a little headway, but kept the New Zealanders on their toes and slightly nervous about what was going on. They were not certain, apart from the soldiers, whether they were winning or losing. Ironically, the soldiers were well in command of the battlefield and knew that they were winning and wondered why the promised counterattacks didn't materialise. Chances are those counterattacks could not have been attempted by day anyway, because the Luftwaffe would have decimated them. So there was a kind of stalemate in that nervousness on the part of the New Zealanders, exacerbated by the previous wartime experience of the key commanders taking the wrong decisions, whereas the Germans were pushing as hard as they could, but without the resources to make any effective leeway. So in a sense, you've got both a psychological and physical stalemate, whereas really, in terms of the numbers involved, the New Zealanders should have been able to sweep the Germans off the field.
Can't help but think that the Germans, the Fallschirmjäger, deal with that fog of war and that friction better with no leadership, just through their aggressiveness, which possibly is from their experience, because presumably a lot of them are pretty seasoned troops, having potentially fought in Poland, Norway, where else have they dropped? Belgium.
Well, there'd been an enormous expansion to corps size. So many of the German paratroopers were green, but they had been indoctrinated, if you like, under the National Socialist system. They were determined. They were ideologically motivated as well. It was always recognised that the Luftwaffe were more National Socialist than the rest of the Wehrmacht, and they went for it. Whereas the New Zealanders, completely taken aback by the scale and character of this airborne invasion, were plodding and were not taking the quick decisions that were required. The major difference for them was that whereas in 1914-18 there was clearly a front line with a rear area, in this type of warfare there's no front line. The paratroopers can suddenly materialise from anywhere and be reinforced, surprisingly, from unexpected directions as well. So
that potentially the decisive decision from Andrew comes that first evening when he evacuates the summit of Hill 107. Why did he come to that decision? Because he is in control of what should be the dominant position of the battlefield.
Yes, that's correct. But having held his own against the main power of the attack, he called upon Harjes, the brigade commander, to support him with reinforcements. Because the other battalions had done even better than Andrew, Harjes felt everything was in the bag, and that Andrew, being a VC winner, would hold his ground, and he decided he would not reinforce. Andrew, as the day wore on, became increasingly concerned, feeling that he had something like 50% casualties and no sign of reinforcements, radioed Harjes during the day with all the problems with intermittent communications and said, look, by the end of the day, if you don't reinforce me, I'm going to have to pull off here. And Harjes, who is not himself either, very tetchily responds by saying, well, if you must, you must. And then 10 minutes later, he gets back on the air and says, I'm sending 2 companies as reinforcements, whereas the plan called for battalion reinforcements, and they simply were not following the plan, something they'd rehearsed for weeks before. So basically, the 2 key commanders are sort of going to pieces in a way. It's difficult to get into their heads, which is why I chose the structure that I used in the book. I'm trying to narrate the action through the viewpoints of those who are taking part, because then you can understand why some of these bizarre decisions were taken. Being an ex-soldier, I don't make any value judgments about what they're doing. I'm just pointing out what influenced their decision-making process. Because unusually, that one battle on that one hill determines the outcome of the entire campaign on Crete. So it was the point at which to analyse and decide why it went wrong. Because once they're off that hill, it enabled the Germans to fly in reinforcements, which turned the tide of the battle.
Well, it's interesting because that hill, they essentially just cede it. There's not really a fight. The Germans sort of stumble on it and realise that there's nobody there, which I found quite surprising. You'd have thought they'd be pushed off. Even if they were going, you'd have thought there'd be something to push them off.
Well, what is interesting is that the initial assaults were very costly for the Germans. Thereafter, they attempted to infiltrate their way up on the hill. This coincided with the New Zealanders deciding to throw in the towel in terms of occupying the hill. And the ironical thing is that German probing attacks were going up the hill at the same time as New Zealand columns were coming down the hill. And the forces passed each other in the night. And the chances are, after the enormous carnage of the day, the soldiers probably didn't want to have a go at each other. Both sides, I believe, were thinking in terms of survival, as soldiers do. They would immediately follow the orders, whoever is leading them. But funnily enough, it was a form of blind man's buff. The New Zealanders didn't have any substantial contact with the Germans as they withdrew. And the Germans, despite what they said after the action, did not fight a heroic action to storm the top of the hill against severe opposition. When they got there, the New Zealanders had gone.
I think that's the other thing that's interesting, that the Germans they secure the hill, but that's not to say the student is aware that the hill's secure, which makes you wonder that evening or overnight, he's seen tremendous losses. Why does he choose to what could be reinforce failure the next day and double down on his losses? I mean, does he even have more airborne troops to send? Because another potential problem, presumably, is he only has a finite amount of transports. So every time they fly in, he has fewer and fewer transports.
The student had gambled everything on one throw. He was convinced that his oil spot strategy would win and that the defence would be paralysed by this blow. There was no backup blow if the first one didn't work. So you're right, he had completely run out of reinforcements. Interestingly, as more and more aircraft are being shot down or damaged and could no longer be used, that meant that many of the Fallschirmjäger who were due to fly out on subsequent waves couldn't get a seat on the aircraft. And so they're left marooned at the air bases. And Oberst, who was in charge of that side of the operation around the airfields, gathered up all these men that had lost their seats on earlier aircraft and formed an ad hoc battalion, some 550 strong. He then offered these to student and said, I have a ad hoc battalion here that you can use if you so wish. Student hadn't asked for it, so it's a supreme case of initiative. At the same time, student had been very calm in the face of total catastrophe. Maybe he hadn't been thinking properly, we don't know, because he'd been shot in the head not so long before. But he stuck to his guns and decided eventually that he would have to build a Schwerpunkt and concentrate his force at one end of the island, which is what all the Luftwaffe generals have been telling him what to do all the time. So Student's star is not in the ascendant. And that night he was facing ruin because he was Goering's glamour boy, presented to Hitler with his support. They got this invasion underway. And what Student's going to have to tell Goering is that his elite regiment was no more. The Sturm regiment had something like 80% casualties. It was no longer combat effective. So Student went to bed that night in the Grand Bretagne Hotel, which is a luxury residence, with a pistol next to his bed, just in case he got any more bad news, because he's got to tell all this to Goering the following day. But during the night, he managed to get a Junkers 52 pilot to actually land on Maleme and find out what was going on. And they discovered that they did at least have a toehold on Maleme, but nowhere else. So you didn't have to, it was a no-brainer, really. There was only one place, if you were going to carry on with this operation, that you could reinforce. And he decided to switch all his resources to Maleme, which is a brave decision, because all the force that had landed at Rothinnon and Iraculan were told to get on with it and survive as best they can.
That next day, I'm right in saying the transports actually just come in and land at the airfield. Is that's still contested ground, though, presumably?
Yes, they came in under fire and they couldn't land on the airfield, and they landed on the beach just beyond the airfield. In so doing, they identified a blind spot to New Zealand artillery fire, which they reported back to Athens. And the following day, when the big Ju-52 fly-in air-land operation began, they knew roughly where the fire would be coming from. So yes, it was a risk, but less of a risk because you know broadly where you should be landing, or at least taxiing once you're on the ground. And this is another interesting comparison because you've got a student masterminding this operation from a luxury hotel room in Athens, whereas Harjes is stuck in a ditch in his brigade headquarters being constantly strafed by the Luftwaffe. And Andrew is taking the same decisions, if you like, as student from a foxhole in the ground. So these are different pressures acting on these individuals.
When does Freiberg become involved? Who's in charge of the defence of the whole of the island? Isn't he, Freiberg? So at what point does he try to get a grip? Because presumably at some point he realises that they've got a problem at Maleme.
Freiberg took mainly correct decisions in that he immediately passed on the reserve to the brigade commanders fighting the battle. He guessed there was a crisis, and so he released the island reserve to the New Zealanders to do with as they wished, and they botched it. So actually Freiberg's kind of blameless in that sense. And also Freiberg made his name at Gallipoli in the First World War and had spent much of the interwar period in England. And he got the appointment to command the island because he had a personal relationship with Churchill. Churchill thought he was the man for the job because he had conducted the rearguard withdrawal from Greece effectively. And so he got Churchill's vote. So there wasn't much more that Freiberg could do, which is the role of the senior commander, to make certain that your subordinates have got the resources they need to fight the battle to achieve the aim that they want.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Robert Kershaw and we're discussing the Battle for Crete. At what point did they finally order the withdrawal of the airfield and give it up?
Well, this was Andrew's decision, so it wasn't a strategic decision. Andrew said to Harjes, his brigade commander, if you don't reinforce, I've got to pull out. There's a political dimension to this, which is these are New Zealanders. They're not English. And this is what affected Freiberg as well. If you lose this battle, when you go back to New Zealand, you've got to explain to all the wives and mums and dads why it was, because of your decision, they're prisoners of war somewhere in Germany. So there is a political pressure on their decision-making. Now, Andrew, on Hill 107, felt he was about to lose the battle. If he stayed there, at dawn, he wouldn't be able to move because the Luftwaffe would prevent any movement, and eventually his battalion would be taken out by the Germans and they would all be prisoners of war. And after the war, when he goes back to New Zealand, who's going to blame? Who are they going to blame for having their men locked up for the duration of the war? So that is another pressure. Failure has particular connotations.
Well, I couldn't quite work out how beaten the New Zealanders were, or whether it was the commanders who felt that they were beaten. That's probably a fine line.
That's correct. It's puzzling. The soldiers were totally surprised when there were orders to withdraw because they'd been trouncing the enemy. So it was the commanders that bottled out, not the soldiers. The soldiers were staggered that they should withdraw when they clearly were in the ascendant.
So what does the loss of the airfield mean for the rest of the campaign? Is that the key point that the Germans now use to bring everything in?
Yes. Failure at the Thymnon, failure at Iraculum, a toehold at Maleme. So if you're going to take this island, your only hope is to switch the amphibious assault that was on its way. Much of it was dispersed by the Royal Navy anyway. But any reinforcements you've got, and they've got the Mountain Division, which is due to fly in, and the decision was taken to fly it into Maleme, concentrate on the west side of the island, and then roll it up from west to east, which was the correct decision. I mean, Student got it wrong, really, because he should have done that in the first instance, gone for a consolidated area where he could concentrate force and then break out.
The whole concept sounds wonderful, oil spots, and you could see graphically how it would work, but in practice, you just end up with lots of little units everywhere that's not able to do much, unless there's something happening somewhere else and you're just a disruptor. So how is Crete subsequently viewed? Because this is interesting. I mean, is it seen as a great airborne victory? I mean, what does it do for the concept of the airborne, which, as you point out, is a new thing? You know, the British and the Americans are scrabbling to start their airborne units.
It indicates what Student believed in, that large-scale airborne operations could achieve strategic objectives, which the Allies certainly attempted to do at D-Day and at Arnhem and across the Rhine. So that was a step in the right direction. The problem was, because of the cost, both in physical aircraft and manpower terms, the senior commanders tended to bottle out when it came to their use. We have this misnomer, if you like, where Hitler tells Student, that's it, the day of the Fallschirmjäger is over. I don't see a future in airborne operations. What he meant was, i.e. parachuting. The Fallschirmjäger arm continued to expand from division and eventually to army level status, because the training that the paratroopers received made them excellent shock troops. And so they were used as the fire brigade on various fronts throughout the rest of the war. The Allies, after Crete, realised they needed to get ahead of this game before the Germans did anything more, and that they should create and expand their own airborne arm. Churchill had already taken the decision in June 1941, after their successful employment in the Blitzkrieg, to expand the British airborne forces, for example. But it wasn't until after what happened at Crete that this really received momentum, and the RAF were told to get on with it and support the concept, as distinct from trying to oppose it, which had been happening in that interim period. The Americans twigged immediately and began creating and expanding their airborne capability, which was soon up to 3 divisions in strength.
What's interesting is, from the German point of view, whilst it might have been their last great airborne operation, they had achieved something that they probably couldn't have done if they'd tried to do it by invading using the Navy, because presumably the Royal Navy would have outgunned them. So they actually did achieve something that they wouldn't otherwise have achieved through the use of the airborne.
Yes, they kind of proved the concept. There's no doubt about that. But the cost, you have to say, was it worth it? Because actually what it did was it turned Crete into the biggest prisoner of war camp of the war, because the garrison on the island did nothing, achieved nothing, and could do nothing because of its proximity.
I only have really one more question, because I hadn't realised that double VC winner Charles Upham was on Crete. For some reason, I thought both his VCs were one in the desert, I think. What did he get his VC for? Is his first VC he gets at, is it Maleme?
Yes, 2 actions whereby he single-handedly reduced a number of German machine gun positions with pistol and grenade.
Determined to win the war on his own.
A remarkable soldier, actually.
Yeah, remarkable indeed. Well, Robert, thank you. I enjoyed your book immensely. Loyal listener, if you want to know more, the book to read is The Hill, The Brutal Fight for Hill 107 in the Battle of Crete. That is all for this episode. Don't forget, if you regularly enjoy the show, why not sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.